President Trump visited China this past May, and when he came back, his White House told us it was a historic success. They told us he secured deals, that he delivered for American workers, that he walked into Beijing and made the Chinese blink. I've spent decades in the United States Army. I've studied strategy, negotiation, and the art of geopolitical leverage at every level. And I will tell you plainly, what happened in Beijing was not a victory. It was a failure, a predictable, avoidable, self-inflicted failure. And today I'm going to walk you through it point by point. I'm going to show you exactly what the White House claimed, what actually happened, and why none of this should surprise anyone who has been paying attention to the strategic realities of the U.S.-China relationship over the past decade. The first thing you need to understand, and this is foundational, is context. You cannot understand Trump's trip to China without understanding what led up to it. The United States has been waging an economic and technological war against China for nearly 10 years. This is not a partisan point. This started under Trump's first term in 2018. It was continued by Joe Biden. And then Trump, coming back into office in 2025, massively escalated it. Tariffs as high as 145%, export restrictions on semiconductors, restrictions on quantum computing components, a full-spectrum economic offensive. And then, just a few months before this trip, in August of 2025, Trump was standing in front of cameras boasting that America had, quote, incredible cards that could, quote, destroy China. Destroy China. Those were his words. So let me ask you a strategic question. If someone told you for years they were going to destroy you, put export restrictions on your technology, slapped you with 145% tariffs, and then 2 months later showed up at your door asking for favors, would you help them? Of course not. No rational government would. And the Chinese government, whatever you think of it, is rational. It is strategic. And it was not interested in bailing out the man who declared economic war on it. Segment 2. What the White House claimed, 3 to 8:30. Let's go to the White House fact sheet, because this is where the spin begins in earnest. The Trump administration published a fact sheet claiming that the president secured, quote, historic deals with China, delivering for American workers, farmers, and industry. That's the headline. Historic deals, delivering for workers. Now, I want you to hold that framing in your mind as I tell you something else. When Trump flew to China, he brought with him a dozen of the most powerful corporate CEOs in America. Elon Musk, Tim Cook of Apple, Jensen Huang of Nvidia, Stephen Schwarzman of Blackstone. He surrounded himself with some of the wealthiest men on earth, billionaires, oligarchs, and flew them to Beijing on a diplomatic mission.
Ask yourself, when was the last time a U.S. president took a delegation of billionaire CEOs to a foreign country and called it a mission to help American workers? This was a corporate lobbying trip dressed up as diplomacy. The goal was not to help the American working class. The goal was to help these massive corporations gain access to the Chinese market of 1.4 billion people and the largest middle class on earth. I'm not saying that as a criticism of capitalism or free markets. I'm saying it because the framing is dishonest. If you're going to make a deal, at least be honest about who benefits. And the fact sheet was not honest. Now, let's go through the specific claims. Segment 3. Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, 8:30 to 1600. The first major claim in the White House fact sheet is that Trump and President Xi Jinping agreed on Iran, and specifically that they agreed on keeping the Strait of Hormuz open and non-militarized. I want to dissect this very carefully because it is strategically important. And the spin here is particularly brazen. Yes, China and the United States both said they want the Strait of Hormuz to remain open. Secretary of State Rubio presented this as evidence of alignment. It is not. Here is the strategic reality. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical choke points on the planet.
Roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through it. Of course, China doesn't want it militarized or blocked. China imports enormous quantities of oil that transits that strait. But we both want the strait open is the lowest possible bar you can set for diplomatic agreement. It's the equivalent of saying two nations agree that fire is hot. The deeper strategic disagreement, the one the White House conveniently omitted, is the question of who is responsible for the instability in the region. China has been consistent and unambiguous. The United States is the culprit. Beijing has consistently demanded that Washington stop its military operations against Iran and come to the negotiating table. And there's another layer here. The Quincy Institute, one of the few responsible anti-interventionist think tanks in Washington, published an important analysis making this clear. China's UN ambassador actually criticized a joint US-Bahrain resolution on the Strait of Hormuz. Why? Because even on this narrow issue of the strait being open, the US and China mean different things. From China's perspective, open means ships flow freely through the waterway. Iranian ships, Chinese ships, all ships. And here is the critical point. It is not Iran that has been blockading Chinese vessels. Iran has allowed Chinese commercial and energy ships to pass through without incident. It is the United States military that has been operating in ways that have disrupted commercial traffic. So when China says it wants the strait open, it is implicitly criticizing U.S. military operations, not Iranian ones. There's also the issue of fees. Iran has been charging ships that pass through the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. objects to this. China has reframed it, calling it something like an environmental management fee, a mechanism that states bordering the Persian Gulf might reasonably charge. That is a fundamentally different position from the American one. So what Trump called agreement on Iran was actually a masking of deep strategic disagreement. And I'll tell you something further. Trump launched what can only be described as a war of aggression against Iran, a war of choice, unnecessary, destabilizing. It caused oil prices to double. It caused gasoline prices in the United States to more than double in just a matter of months. And it contributed directly to inflationary pressures that are now at their highest level in 3 years, just months before midterm elections in November. Xi Jinping was not going to throw Trump a lifeline on Iran. Why would he? The Chinese have strategic patience. They watched Trump create this mess, and they have no incentive to clean it up for him. Segment 4, Trade Boards and Economic Decoupling. The next claim in the White House fact sheet is the announcement of a new Board of Trade and a Board of Investment between the United States and China. I'll be brief here because I think most people with any strategic literacy can see through this. A board is a formality. It is a committee. It is a bureaucratic structure that allows both sides to say something happened when nothing of substance has changed. Let me give you the macro context. U.S.-China trade as a percentage of China's overall global trade has been declining for years, and this is not an accident. China has been deliberately and systematically diversifying its trade partnerships, shifting toward ASEAN nations, toward the global South, toward South-South economic cooperation. China's largest trading partner is now ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, not the United States, not Europe. This is part of a long-term strategic trend that analysts call gradual decoupling. It won't happen overnight. It may take decades, but the direction is unmistakable. And here is the strategic logic driving it from China's side. The more dependent China is on trade with the United States, the more leverage Washington has to weaponize that dependency. China learned this lesson from the trade war, and China's response has been to reduce that dependency systematically and deliberately. So announcing a new board for trade and investment in this context is largely theater. The structural trend is moving in the opposite direction. China is not going to dramatically increase its exposure to the American market when it knows that a future U.S. president, or this very president, could use that exposure as a weapon. The board is a fig leaf. It gives Trump something to point to. It gives nothing of strategic consequence. Segment 5. Rare Earths and the Self-inflicted Wound. Now we get to what I consider one of the most important and revealing sections of this entire episode, the rare earths issue. The White House fact sheet states that, quote, China will address U.S. concerns regarding supply chain shortages related to rare earths and other critical minerals. Notice the language. Will address. Concerns. That is extraordinarily weak diplomatic language. It commits to nothing concrete. It says China will pay attention to something. That is not an agreement. That is a conversation. But here is the deeper issue, and this is what I need every person watching this to understand. The only reason there is a U.S. rare earth supply chain problem in the first place is because of the trade war that Trump himself launched and escalated. Let me explain the sequence of events clearly because it matters. China dominates the global supply chain for rare earth elements and critical minerals. Not partially, dominates. The mining, the processing, the refining. These materials are essential for advanced manufacturing, semiconductors, electric vehicles, precision-guided munitions, aircraft systems. The United States military-industrial complex cannot produce its weapons systems without access to Chinese rare earths. This is a strategic vulnerability that should have been addressed years ago, but it wasn't. When Trump escalated his trade war against China in 2025, threatening 145% tariffs, imposing export restrictions on AI chips, quantum computing components, and other advanced technology, China responded, as any strategically rational actor would. China announced its own export restrictions on rare earths, targeting the United States. This was not aggression. This was retaliation. This was China exercising its legitimate leverage in response to American escalation. The result? The United States suddenly found itself facing critical shortages of materials it needs for both its economy and its military. Defense contractors started raising alarms. The vulnerability became impossible to ignore. And now Trump visits China and announces as a diplomatic achievement that China will address American concerns about these very shortages. But the shortages only exist because Trump started the trade war. He created the problem. He then traveled to China and partially uncreated it. And he called that a victory. If I did that in the Army, created a crisis through poor planning, and then partially resolved it and called myself a hero, I would not have lasted long. This is not strategy. This is damage control being sold as triumph.
Segment 6. Boeing. A loss dressed as a win. Let's talk about Boeing. This is one of the clearest examples of the dishonesty in the White House's framing. The Trump administration announced that China agreed to purchase 200 American-made Boeing aircraft. The president presented this as a significant economic win. Reuters reported the market's response immediately. Boeing shares dropped 4% following the announcement. The stock went down, not up, down. Why? Because before Trump's trip, the expectation, the baseline estimate, was that China would purchase approximately 500 Boeing aircraft. Trump flew the CEO of Boeing across the Pacific. He sat in meetings with top Chinese officials. He spent days in Beijing with the full diplomatic machinery of the United States government behind him. And he came home with 200 planes instead of 500. The market understood instantly what the White House was trying to obscure. This was not a gain. This was a loss. The benchmark was 500. The result was 200. You do not celebrate falling 60% short of expectations as a historic deal. And yet the fact sheet presented it as a victory. Boeing's CEO traveled on the same diplomatic mission. The entire trip was designed in part to deliver a major commercial aviation deal with China, and they came home with less than half of what analysts had anticipated. If you were a shareholder in Boeing that day, you understood perfectly well what had happened. The market doesn't spin. The market reflects reality. Segment 7.
agricultural products returning to the status quo. The third specific industry claim in the White House fact sheet concerns agricultural products. Trump announced that China will purchase $17 billion annually in U.S. agricultural products, soybeans, beef, poultry, and will restore market access for American food exports. Let me give you the same strategic context I gave you on rare earths. Why did China restrict purchases of U.S. soybeans and other agricultural products in the first place? Not because of ideological hostility to American farmers, not because Xi Jinping woke up one morning and decided he disliked Iowa. China used agricultural purchases as a point of economic leverage, as a retaliatory tool, after the United States launched its trade and technology war against China. When Trump threatened 145% tariffs, China said, "Very well, we will stop buying your soybeans. We will restrict American agricultural imports." That put real economic pressure on American farmers, particularly in states that grow soybeans and raise cattle, states, incidentally, that tend to vote Republican. So after years of trade war escalation, Trump visits Beijing. China agrees to resume purchasing agricultural products and to restore market access. And the White House calls it a win. But think about what actually happened. We are back to approximately where we were before Trump escalated the trade war. The baseline conditions that existed before Trump's escalation have been partially restored. That is not progress. That is recovering lost ground. That is paying a strategic cost. Years of trade war, inflation, supply chain disruption, alienated allies, to end up roughly where you started. A general who retreats under fire, suffers significant casualties, and then reoccupies his original position does not call that a victory. He calls it a recovery. And even that word is generous if the casualties were self-inflicted. Segment 8. The semiconductor silence. Now I want to talk about something that was notably absent from the White House fact sheet. The semiconductors issue. The microchip question. Because sometimes what is not said tells you more than what is. Nvidia is the most important company in the world when it comes to advanced graphics processing units, the chips that power artificial intelligence research and development. It recently became the first company in history to reach a market capitalization of $5.5 trillion. Its CEO, Jensen Huang, traveled to China on Air Force One alongside Trump, Elon Musk, and others. Why was Jensen Huang there? Because Nvidia desperately wants back into the Chinese market. At its peak, Nvidia controlled approximately 95% of the Chinese market for advanced chips. That share has fallen to essentially zero because the U.S. government imposed export restrictions on China, banning the sale of Nvidia's most advanced chips in an attempt to prevent China from developing artificial intelligence that might compete with American technology companies. The strategic logic was, if we deny China access to these chips, we maintain a technological monopoly. We control the future of AI. The practical result was the opposite. China, recognizing that it could not rely on American technology without being held hostage to American policy, redirected enormous state resources into developing its own domestic chip ecosystem. China built its own semiconductor industry. Not perfectly, not overnight, but substantially. The export restrictions accelerated Chinese self-sufficiency rather than preventing it. The Trump administration recognized this strategic miscalculation, so it announced it would ease restrictions and allow Chinese companies to purchase the H200 chip, Nvidia's second most advanced chip. This was supposed to be a diplomatic olive branch, a sweetener to encourage Chinese cooperation. China was not interested. Beijing has decided it will not become redependent on American technology suppliers after having been burned so badly by those dependencies. The New York Times noted after the summit that Nvidia's future in China remains deeply unclear. Reuters reported that no H200 chip deliveries have been made to Chinese companies, despite American government approval. The Chinese government made a strategic decision: self-sufficiency over convenience, independence over dependency. And no amount of Trump diplomacy was going to reverse that. The White House fact sheet didn't even try to claim this as a win. They left it out entirely. When an administration that claims historic victories on every issue doesn't even mention something, it tells you exactly how badly that something failed. Segment 9. The strategic picture. Let me step back and give you the full strategic picture, because I think it's important to understand what this trip reveals. Not just about one visit, but about the trajectory of American power and strategy. The United States spent nearly a decade waging economic and technological war against China. Tariffs, export restrictions, supply chain pressure. The explicit goal was to contain China's rise, to prevent China from developing economically and technologically in ways that might challenge American primacy. That strategy has failed. Not partially, substantially. China's economy has continued to grow. China's technological capabilities, particularly in areas like artificial intelligence and advanced manufacturing, have continued to advance. The export restrictions on chips accelerated Chinese investment in domestic alternatives. The tariffs pushed China to diversify its trade relationships and reduce dependency on American markets. Every weapon the United States wielded in this economic war had unintended consequences that worked against American interests. And meanwhile, what happened at home? The tariffs did not bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. The number of manufacturing jobs has been falling, not rising. Inflation is at its highest level in 3 years. Gasoline prices have more than doubled because of the supply chain disruptions and the war in Iran. American consumers are paying more. American workers are not better off. Trump went to Beijing surrounded by billionaires, desperate for a political victory he could bring home before November's midterm elections. He needed to show something, anything, that he could point to and say, "This is working." He needed Xi Jinping to hand him a lifeline. Xi Jinping was not going to do that. Why would he? China has strategic patience. China plays a long game. China watched the United States wage a decade of economic warfare against it, and China adapted, diversified, and made itself more resilient. And when the man who called China a country he could destroy showed up 2 months later asking for help, China politely declined to provide it. That is not strength. What you saw in Beijing was not American strength. It was American desperation meeting Chinese strategic patience. And strategic patience, properly executed, beats desperation every time. The lesson here is not complicated. You cannot wage war on a nation economically, threaten to destroy it publicly, and then expect it to make concessions that benefit you when you knock on its door. That is not how statecraft works. That is not how strategic competition works. And any serious analyst, any strategist worth his training, could have told you that before Trump's plane ever left the runway. This trip was a failure, not a surprise. A failure that was written in advance by years of strategically incoherent policy. I'm Colonel Douglas MacGregor. Thank you for listening. We'll continue this conversation next time.